Police officers of Reddit, what are some laws that you feel uncomfortable enforcing because you disagree with them? Arresting homeless people. We usually just bring them in but forget to file paperwork on them, so they get a warm bed, a breakfast, and no record. It's not a specified law as such, but in the UK people can use reasonable force to protect themselves, others and Property Act. Obviously everyone has their own interpretation of what reasonable force is, but I remember going to one job where a bloke was sat on his couch with a beer watching TV when a drunk bloke has just walked straight into his living room via the front door. A confrontation ensued and the drunk trespasser had become aggressive and a fight ensued. Long story short, the trespasser was given a proper shoe-in. So much so he's ended up in the street where he has then called the police. We attended and his injuries were substantial enough that the house occupant was arrested for grievous bodily harm, GBH, and it most definitely rubbed me up the wrong way in being involved in that job because I totally sympathized with the guy and felt any of us would have probably done the same thing if we were in his position. Prior to legalization here in Canada, my city for years had a marijuana related arrest rate almost 70% lower than the national average. This is in a college town where students make up 20% of the population. So it's not like there wasn't a lot of it in town. There wasn't any policy or directive regarding marijuana issued. It was just a result of all officers personally turning a blind eye to pot unless the citizen was being a jerk. Traffic tickets. I'd pull people over, give a verbal warning about whatever dumb or unsafe thing they just did, check for warrants and let them go. I got funny looks for the blank spot in my work card where the tickets were supposed to go, but since it's illegal to officially or unofficially have a quota system, it could never be used against me in my job evaluation. In my college town there were really only 4 bars within walking distance to campus, and they were all notoriously lax on their ID policy. Any fake got you in the door, and sometimes you didn't even need that. But the cops always kept their distance because that meant students were drinking under the regulation of bouncers and bartenders, which was obviously preferable to the alternative of constantly throwing house parties. Back in my Leo career days, I was always very uncomfortable with using dogs to search for drugs. Yeah, they really can sniff out drugs, but the false positive accuracy is so far out of whack with what should be a legal standard for reasonable suspicion that it's little better than guessing. If a dog hits on 100 cars, and 50% of them have no drugs in them, you just violated the civil rights of 50 people based on what a dog said. Dogs aren't people. You can't interview or cross-examine them in court. Ex-police officer here in the US. The two that stand out the most is how much officer discretion is used in each scenario for someone to go to jail. Could be the same person with the same amount of illegal substance. I could destroy the evidence and send them away, or I could take them to jail. Up to the officer. The second would be the ability to ticket each window as illegal tint instead of one just for the car. My friend is a cop in an area with real gang violence and other issues. Chief got up for the daily briefing and told them they needed to prioritize reducing recycling theft, which was homeless people digging through recycle bins to get CRV items. I'm not a cop anymore, but I rarely arrested for personal use marijuana. It's a harmless plant. Selling is a different story, because most of those dealers are supporting a cartel or a higher crime, and I don't agree with that. There was one case where a bunch of guys in my agency would have arrested in a heartbeat, and honestly, by law I was required to investigate, but didn't. A car drove through the back of someone's house because the driver confused the brake and gas pedal. The house that was driven through had a lone marijuana plant in another room, which is a felony in my state, and growers get it on in my state. I stepped in front of it so the firefighters and others wouldn't notice and raise hell about it. This homeowner was a good ole boy, and a church-going father who worked a nice job and contributed greatly to society. I'm not trying to ruin his family's life over a plant. When I walked out of the house and came back in, the plant was missing. He was probably eating bricks the whole time I stood there. Now that I'm not a cop, I thought about leaving a letter in his mailbox telling him I knew about the plant, but I don't want to make him paranoid, lol. Not a cop, but my buddy is. He absolutely hates pulling traffic stops and giving tickets unless the person is doing something super reckless. He thinks for the most part they are useless and add to the community's dislike of police. Not to mention they're statistically pretty dangerous for him. When I was a police officer, I hated marijuana laws. I would just tell the person to dump it on the ground when I found it. I did the same when I'd find underage kids with alcohol. Dump it out and be on your way. Aside from that, I pretty much never wrote tickets for equipment violations such as a headlight out, etc. I would just politely let the person know they needed to fix it. Lastly, I would rarely write tickets for expired registration, especially when the person was clearly struggling financially. I couldn't sleep at night knowing I had basically punished someone whose only crime was being poor. Weed laws. Unless you are a distributor, I don't care. Also don't care about doing traffic stops. Last one I did was in March. I live in a community that is basically addicted to hunting, so most kids have their own rifle and car by 17. Our school obviously has a rule about not allowing guns on the property in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes people are hunting before school though and forget to drop the gun off at home first. My friend did this once. He was already a few minutes late for class, so he went to ask for a slip to return the gun. The gun was unloaded, in his trunk, and locked in a case like it was supposed to be. He went to the office to ask if he could be excused to return it home. It would take him maybe 15 minutes tops. Nope. The school ducking called the police. One of the town cops came, listened to the story, searched the vehicle and found the gun, perfectly and safely packed away. He looked the superintendent dead in the eye and said he wasn't going to arrest a kid for trying to do the right thing. The superintendent later tried and failed to have the cop fired. Not an officer but criminal defense attorney. Driving while license revoked tickets are an absolute racket in North Carolina and savvy cops have realized they don't care to enforce it. Basically what happens is a lower income person gets a traffic ticket for speeding or whatever. The judge will give them up to 30 days to pay the ticket after the court date. However, because the fines are generally $213 to $263, a lot of lower income people cannot afford to pay the ticket. So, once the time to pay expires, the DMV revokes their license. Then, someone will get pulled over for having a revoked license. At this point, they still have the reason for the revocation outstanding. They have a new, more serious, ticket, and they have to pay reinstatement fees with the DMV to get their license back, assuming they are able to clear up the reason for the revocation. Oh yeah, if you plead guilty to driving while license revoked, your license will be suspended automatically for 1 year for your first offense or even longer if it's not your first offense. Generally, people will not come to me, defense attorney, until they are already charged with driving while license revoked because that is when they realize how screwed they are. The good news is, I have talked to some officers about these driving while license revoked tickets who don't care about the offense. They just want to see the client get their license back. So, they will either tell the DA they don't want it prosecuted or just get it set on a court date when the officer won't be there so I can get it dismissed. It is all about the money. Total ducking racket. Where I work there is a statute prohibiting leaving your car running unattended. It is called no puffing laws. This is very popular during the winter time because nobody likes to freeze while their car is warming up. However, doing this makes your car more likely to get stolen. It's our policy that if an individual reports their car being stolen because they left it running, they will be ticketed. It basically penalizes the victim of a crime. I'm not a police officer. I'm a CPS agent. I'm uncomfortable with allowing children to stay in homes that don't have water and electricity as long as they have a source of water and a place to bathe. Schools and relatives turn to me and say, "Why aren't you helping?" Because I can't. It's the law. Edit. I've never gotten gold before, and I'm not sure I deserve it. Regardless. Thank you. Not a police officer, but still technically law enforcement at the time. When I was in the Coast Guard, I did a lot of drug and migrant interdiction down in the Caribbean. Chasing drug smugglers was pretty fun, but interdicting the migrants was always sad. We would usually find Haitians or Cubans and the Haitians were always much worse off. It was pretty heartbreaking having to send them back after seeing the state they were in, and the state of country they were trying to leave. They would go through such great lengths to leave and we had to stop them. One guy tried to light himself on fire and others would try and injure themselves to try and get us to take them to US healthcare facilities. The only redeeming thing about interdicting them was their ships were always very shoddily made, and oftentimes our act of interdicting them was also us saving them from a sinking ship. Personal marijuana use. Who the duck cares? I'll arrest a dealer, but not users. Course I don't really patrol anymore. I train. Blinkers. Tint. Loud sound systems. I don't care about. Now if you are being a D, it is game on for all of those things. Haha. Don't be a D. My uncle is a police officer. He's always said that he tries not to write tickets for broken tail lights. He says that in most cases people driving around with a broken tail light are doing so because they can't afford to fix it immediately, and giving them a ticket on top of that just makes it even more difficult for them to fix it. There's a policy in the province that I work that basically says if you're called to a domestic you have to arrest and charge someone. So you basically have to pick who the main aggressor was and arrest, charge, tell them they can't go home. A lot of times there's no injuries or evidence that anything even happened, so it puts you in a difficult spot. Also, I dislike pulling people over and giving tickets. If I see something awful, I'd be compelled to give a warning. The tickets where I work are just too expensive for the average person. Homelessness. We would get so many calls of transients in certain areas. Most are just laying in the sun on the grass, not bothering anyone. But all it takes is a phone call from a board commissioner or someone in power and we'd get a call to tell them to move. We all hated it. Seatbelt tickets. I'm sure this is not a popular one, but if you don't like wearing your seatbelt while driving, I could care less. If you want a new face, that's on you. Marijuana. Smoke it all you want. Just don't drive. Fishing license. Enough said. Been doing it for a while. Really hate to enforce tinted windows. Just roll them down before I get to your car please. Responsible speeding. And simple assault when the person had it coming. What I really like to enforce, and I mean literally to enforce, handicap parking, littering, and any traffic infraction I can when the person is being an ass. I disagree with anything cannabis related, unless you're in possession of a ton of it and it's obvious they're selling it to who they're not supposed to. If you have personal use, usually I and the other good cops usually just confiscate or make the person destroy it themselves in our presence. Also, not a state law, but we have a $500 impound fee that we're forced to enforce on impound related to driving with a suspended, revoked license and possession of cannabis. Generally, that means we're taking a vehicle from someone that can't afford to get their license back and holding their vehicle hostage while it accrues more daily fees. 9 times out of 10 these people are decent folks who are just trying to get their kids to school or go to work. There's only a few people on our department who like impounding vehicles under this ordinance because the admin likes it. Everyone else sees it for what it is, a giant money grab. My dad was a cop, MP. Specifically, he thought banning radar detectors was dumb. His reasoning was because you are trying to get people to slow down and a speeding ticket was a result of people not slowing down. Ticketing for using a radar detector is just ticketing to give out tickets, as radar detectors make people slow down. Edit. I get it. Guys, I was just answering the question. I didn't say I agreed with it or that my dad really thought it through. I never felt comfortable enforcing the laws of gravity. Former cop. I always disliked busting someone for possession of a small, personal use amount of marijuana. I never saw anyone ruin their life with it. Unlike alcohol, bit of a mixed bag busting someone smuggling dealing a large amount. On the one hand, I realize that in a state where marijuana is illegal, that's the only way to distribute it. On the other hand, it's not like I can take your word for it that you aren't selling it to kids or that your product is pure. The answer to that is to just legalize and regulate. We're supposed to ticket anyone on a cell phone behind the wheel while on the road. Ticket is $164. If you're on it while at a red light but still aware of your surroundings, I'll most likely give a warning. If you're on it while driving, you'll get a ticket. Everyone checks their phone at a red light. Just do it quickly. This question is a big reason I am getting out of law enforcement and moving to EMS. Marijuana is strictly enforced in my state while alcohol is constantly abused and is the cause of majority of domestic violence, assault and DUI. I used to love being a cop. I got into this with my entire goal being to help children. I was horrifically abused as a kid and wanted to be the white knight for kids so they never had to endure what I did. Due to poor policies and our society blacklisting law enforcement, it is impossible for us to do our jobs anymore. We are told to enforce drug laws. They make the state the most money, while the attorney's office drops DV assault cases and aws rapists as often as a toddler drops their utensils. I refuse to charge marijuana in personal use amounts. I will not write tickets for bullet traffic violations. I will stop and enforce more egregious offenses obviously. I feel like we have lost our humanity in a lot of ways by trying to solve everything through the legal system. Jails don't fix drug problems. Cops shouldn't be focused on fighting what the state believes is crime. They should be helping people, saving lives. Persons and property crimes should be the focus of law enforcement, not petty crap like THC. How broad the term family member is when it comes to domestic battery. It could include college roommates, adult male brothers who don't live together. Like, no, these people are not what people imagine when they think inescapable abusive relationship. All things MJ. The only thing a stoner is a danger to is a bag of funans. One guy I work with left his PD after 19 years because he got sick of the justice system's handling of drug abusers dealers. Basically they'd get arrested, then they'd get bailed out for like $40. Then they'd take a plea deal which would be like a $500 fine and a drug rehab class. When they didn't go to the class, which they almost never did, they'd get a warrant on them and the cycle would start again. Basically the justice system doesn't care about drug use. Long ago the people voted for someone who thought that jail would make a good rehab and it doesn't, and these folks get stuck in an endless loop of fines and fees and police interaction and nothing gets done except the judge making their six-figure salary. It's all a game and nobody is taking serious steps to curb the drug problem in the US. And the officers have to keep arresting the same person over and over again until that person either finds their own way out of abuse or overdoses. Plus drugs do crazy things and the officers are put in constant danger for seemingly no reason. Retirement is 25 years in my state. Weed. The penalties are excessive. Trafficking also has a much higher penalty, especially if supplying to a minor. You would get teens who would try to argue with you and say how they were just selling some to their friends. You don't have use this as evidence though, and a quick reminder of their right to silence does the trick. Have literally told one or two to shut up though because they didn't understand self-defense laws. Had a bloke who defended himself and rightly so, but his actions were right on line for justified versus excessive. So we opted to have the courts decide. That unfortunately meant arresting him. He was eventually acquitted and I'm glad for it. Tenancy disputes. Some tenants are crap and deserve to be evicted, but there are a lot of landlords who treat tenants badly by not fixing urgent repairs, misusing their entry powers, etc. But if a tenant stops paying all of their rent then they can rightfully be evicted. Sometimes the tenants can become upset and we are called in. We always made sure we transported the evicted tenants to a place of safety. We had one landlord who was notorious for misusing police for this kind of stuff. We eventually ended up fining him because he had refused to repair a smoke alarm in a property. He had called us to evict the poor tenant and got the repair bill and a fine. Never filed a weed charge in Texas. I'm not going to make some kid's life harder because he was smoking a plant. I did arrest 2 people with weed. One for evading arrest, and the other for a DUI, but never because of the weed. Possession of weed. Too many people who mean no harm to anyone pay heavy fines and go to prison for possession of harmless drugs. Never had a bad encounter with anyone who was high, but people abusing alcohol, a legal drug, are so itty to deal with, always. They are either aggressive or don't understand a word you say. Weed needs to be legalized. Country is Germany. I'm currently still studying so technically not a full police officer. In Belgium we have discretionary authority, discretionaire bevoegdheid in Dutch. It means police officers can choose not to report some crimes. This doesn't apply to serious misdemeanors or felonies as it's overruled by having to actually help people, schuldig verzumen Dutch, and being obligated to answer to civilians' legal requests. But if you think some laws related to parking for instance are stupid, you just never write a ticket. First is tinted windows. CA. I can argue good reasons to have tinted windows all day long. I refuse to write a ticket for them, unless you're being an arsehole to me. Second, 6 under 18. We all know it happens. Most of us probably did it. But if I find a couple of 17-year-olds fooling around him or they're not doing anything worth ruining someone's life over. Now if it's a 17-year and 13-year, that's a very different story. Domestics. In my state, the law says that we must arrest someone at a domestic. But people who live together are bound to argue. And so many times jail and trial are not only going to not make things better, they're just going to exacerbate problems. So I do my best just to get everyone calm and separated and talk our way out of legal proceedings. Is this gonna be the highly upvoted bootlicker thread in response to the UPS murder that currently has the public riled up against excessive police force? Anything involving gun laws. My ex-neighbor is a cop and told me a story about his boss chewing him out for failing to turn in his paperwork for a traffic stop within 24 hours. At this point in the story he goes, so I haven't written a ticket in over 3 years. Gained a lot of respect for cops that day. Not an officer but my dad was. He said he never busted many high school parties because he did the same stuff in high school and figured everyone deserved to party every now and then. People in my town really liked him as a cop. Locking people in a cage for a plant that is no threat to society or that has never caused a single overdose death. In Copenhagen the police don't arrest people for smoking cannabis even though the law says it's illegal. As long as you do not harass other people with the smoke or are behaving badly, they only target the sellers. I'm an Irish American Catholic. Shocker that I ended up as a cop. I know, and I refuse to arrest people for stealing food. Lost a few vacation days over it. But duck it, mercy has to take a stand somewhere. So we aren't routinely armed. We carry pava, mace, friction lock batons and cuffs and some officers carry a taser. When there's an incident involving firearms, which is very rare, or to varying degrees weapons like knives then the control room would resource enough armed response vehicle, which is crewed by at least 2 armed police officers who are obviously equipped to deal with that incident. Big up those that don't want to enforce the statutes on cannabis. You yourselves have the power to decriminalize. Not a cop, but in my country self-defense is a joke. If someone tries to stab you and you stab him back with a longer weapon, you're the guilty one. Not a cop but a good friend of mine is. He hates writing tickets. If he pulls someone over for a minor traffic violation, he will reduce it to a warning and just advise the driver of the rules and to be safe when they leave if they're professional and understanding of the circumstances. Having said this, if the driver is immediately being an asshole, they're getting the ticket. He's a stickler just on drugs. Amphetamine and heroin use around our parts is huge. Drunk driving too. Obviously, he's arrested other cops for drunk driving that he is friends with because he doesn't believe in the double standard towards other cops. If he catches someone with weed, he will just stomp it out unless it's some insane amount that would suggest sale. If it's meth, heroin, pills, etc., you're taking a ride. Not a cop, but ran a residence hall at a large public co-ed institution and there was still a curfew for the opposite sex in 2009. Turned my ducking head every time. Also pushed for it to be ended on the grounds that it was discriminating since same-sex couples could feel free to stay at partners all the time. Which of course was not the intent of their heteronormative policy. Told them it needed to be no guests after 9 or all guests after 9. None of them. Duck the people of this town. Cops from my town probably. Shooting up drivers and random strangers who are busy minding their own business. Dispatcher, but I hate when we have to send calls out about drunk people walking. Like at least they aren't driving. Don't police in the US have discretion on what they enforce and what they don't? Not a police officer yet, starting March 2020. But I won't like arresting people for possessing little amounts of cannabis.